Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. Welcome to the final day of SROI Matters 2020. And welcome to this session, Enough Precision for the Decision, Standards and Guidance for Social Value Management, the Examples of SROI and CBA. So my name is Rosie and I work for Social Value UK. I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping points before I hand over to Ben and Daniel. So the first ones are that this session is being recorded and it will be uploaded to Haste Summit hopefully by the end of today, so you'll be able to rewatch it if you would like to. Also, can you please use the chat box that's provided just to introduce yourself and also to ask questions to the speakers. And lastly, can you please stay muted whilst Ben and Daniel are speaking so there's no background noise. Thank you. I will now hand over to Ben.
Thank you, Rosie. Okay, Rosie and I are in the same room, so we're going to have to be clever on the mute here. But thank you, everyone, for joining us at the end of a very long and exciting week at Social Value Matters 2020. I know many of you have been in so many sessions, so thank you for making it to the end and still having the energy to join this session. And this session is one I'm really looking forward to. It's a late addition to the agenda, but an exciting topic. Thank you for just stay on mute. So today, as Rosie said, the title is Enough Precision for the Decision. And that's a catchy phrase that I use quite a lot, and our trainers across the Social Value International Network use a lot as well, because it's very much at the heart of, you know, how we apply our principles, how much levels of rigor do we need when we're collecting data in order to inform decision making. So this is a crucial topic, and I'm delighted to be here today talking it through with Daniel Fujiwara, a man that doesn't need much introduction, but I think you all know he's a thought leader in cost-benefit analysis and well-being valuation. So I'm really pleased that we're taking this opportunity during the practitioner dialogue to discuss this important topic. So what we want to achieve today is set out some of the issues in relation to rigor in terms of data collection, different parts of data collection, and in relation specifically to standards and guidance that exist for social return on investment and cost-benefit analysis. So that's kind of the scope of today's conversation. And what I hope that it does is engages you all and others who are not here today that couldn't join in a further dialogue. And Social Value International are keen to set up a sort of working group to expand on the issues that are brought to the table today, and maybe some sort of paper can be produced or guidance around this. So that's my high level sort of framing for the session. And without further ado, then I'm going to hand over to Daniel to begin in laying out some of these issues.
Thanks, Ben. So we don't have a formal presentation or anything. This is more of a a few minutes of, I think, going back and forth with Ben and myself, and then opening up to the rest of the room. So I think most of you know me, but just in case you don't, I'm currently CEO of Symmetrica Jacobs. We specialize in social value analysis and also well-being and quality of life measurement. And I also, my background's really more in academia, so I've come from that kind of background, and I still have a position at the LSE around mainly on research within these areas, but also some teaching there. And I'm really interested in the methodology element to social value analysis. I've been heavily involved in something called the Green Book, which is the UK official government manual or guidelines on social value measurement. Those were released most recently in 2018, and they're kind of freely available on the Treasury website if you want to look at those. And I've been involved in the kind of the evolution of that bit of guidelines to really kind of push it out into the wider, picking up a lot more wider social and environmental outcomes. And as part of that, I've been really interested in two core elements. rigor when applied to measuring outcomes. So that's after we've determined what the outcomes are. How do we actually measure in a causal sense whether an organization or program has actually created those outcomes, or whether those things would have happened anyway. And the second area is around issues around valuation. So once we know what those outcomes are, what are the rigorous methods for valuing? And what I just want to kick off with is that these technical issues are absolutely core to social value measurement. So if we look at social value measurement, there's what I call a normative aspect. So that's a more ethical aspect. And what I mean by that is there are big, deep moral questions about which stakeholders we should include, and what outcomes we should be measuring and for how long, and whether we should include future generations that aren't currently living. Should we include wildlife and animals into the analysis? All of these are moral, normative, and not really scientific questions. They're not questions that we can answer with data. But that's one core element of social value analysis, which is almost kind of, you could see it as phase one. It's establishing what the framework looks like. And we need to do that for every type of project organization. The next phase then is more of what we call a technical or a scientific endeavor, which is once we're happy with a group of stakeholders and what those outcomes should be, both positive and negative, how do we actually measure and value those? And that's why this kind of more scientific technical debate is so key, because it impinges on both of those two areas. And we need to get it absolutely right, because the levels of decision that are now coming to the fore in terms of using social value analysis is getting really serious and really large. So work that we've been doing at the moment, we're on about 3 or 4 projects. We're actually involved in, I think it's 4 of the largest infrastructure projects in the UK at the moment, and some of these projects are around kind of in the 9 to 10 billion pounds of investment. So we need to get the decision right in terms of that. There are standards that are starting to be developed across lots of the social sciences, and some of that is then leading into best practice. So the Green Book is a good example of that, which has taken really what's going on within economics and statistics and mathematics in terms of these standards around social science and impact measurement, and regurgitating that into a set of best practice principles. So if we take, for example, the outcomes measurement side, we know there's now what we call evidence hierarchies that are being developed, where you can pin basically on a league table or a scale, as it were, methods that are more rigorous and less rigorous for a particular question at hand. So all else constant, you should be using method A over method B, for example. And we know, for example, that a randomized control trial, if that's something that you can run, will give you a much more scientifically validated estimate than, let's say, a small focus group with 4 people asking about what outcomes they had. In the same manner, we know if we're looking at, for example, on the valuation side, if we're looking at trying to place a value on a negative social impact, that contingent valuation, one of the core methods, and I know that's used in SRI as well, is a more rigorous method than a cost avoided or a damage cost method, and there's all of the science and kind of mathematics behind that, the type of to kind of prove it. What I'll kind of I guess leave you with in terms of this first bit of the discussion is, in my first role or my first career, which was about 9 years in the UK government, I actually had a role where I was reviewing lots of scientific studies, policy studies, and increasingly social value studies, and within those SRI studies as well. And we found, when on reviewing a lot of these studies, that the ones that are using less rigorous forms of measurement, and this includes SRI studies, it includes other types of social value studies like cost-benefit analysis, but other more kind of statistical analyses. So looking at all of those across the whole spectrum, my analysis found that those that are using less rigorous forms of measurement and valuation, we tend to see an error between 300 to 1000% in these studies. So these are really serious levels of error. Typically within science, we're fairly comfortable with kind of errors around 5 to 10%, something like that, but we're talking 300 to 1000%. So what we mean by that in lay terms is that the results tended to be a magnitude of 3 to 10 times different to what they should have been if you know a more rigorous method was used. And again, that was across all types of methods that we reviewed. So I think we need a better system to understand the different types of social value methods that are out there, because there's more and they're continually increasing by the day, and some kind of guidance around what is best practice, but also potentially a scale in terms of, you know, which type of methods will typically be, you know, give you enough rigor for a particular setting. So I think we need to think about what type of decisions we're taking and how serious those are, and we need to make some kind of judgment on what the criteria would be. So the first thing might be how much investment is going into a particular program, but it might be other considerations like whether the decision could be reversed or something like that. So climate change is a big issue there. And then I think we need a rating system or something like that that allows us to pick the method that is most suitable and that is applicable for that particular type of intervention. And that's not always going to be the case, that you need these super scientific methods for every single type of intervention. There will be policies that are fairly low cost, or that you need to make a decision fairly quickly, and the decision can be reversed, where actually doing, you know, something overly scientific and robust might actually be wasting resources when you can use them somewhere else. So we need to think clearly in terms of that balance, in terms of these different types of decisions and the different types of methods. So I'll hand back over to Ben now.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I think that's a really good overview of some of the issues that we've been kicking about, particularly around different levels of rigor, standards for that, and different elements of social value measurements. You know, you mentioned deciding what it is that we need to measure in the first place, and you used the phrase normative assumptions, and you know, who is this for and what should be included in that social value measurement. And that's a really important bit. And then once you've decided that, how you measure the accuracy of that change is another bit, and then the causality another bit as well. And I think you're absolutely right. There's a bit of a perhaps a gap or a misunderstanding of what levels of standards are available in each of those different areas of social value measurement. And if we just turn now to sort of the guidance and standards that sort of I'm most familiar with, in terms of SROI and social return investment, most of you here are sort of familiar with that. It is true that we have some guidance and some standards out there, but I think it's fair to say that for some high levels of rigor, certainly with the examples you were giving, Daniel, in terms of, you know, investments in the billions, social return on investment training, we never pretend that doing 2 days of training will equip you with the sort of level to go and do perhaps a level of measurement that is appropriate for that level of decision. However, so I think there is a need for Social Value International to kind of signpost better to standards that and guidance that is appropriate at that different level. And I think you're right in kind of the role we perhaps have now is in setting out all these different types of decisions and how far you need to go. Sort of wanted to sort of point that where SVI is perhaps lacking in guidance and standards for that piece on how to measure something. I think Social Value International and SRI is quite good in setting out standards and guidance for determining what should be measured, as SRI is primarily an accountability framework as much as anything. Our sort of, one of our strengths, I would say, is in creating a social value measurement framework that is pretty good and highly rigorous in understanding or defining what outcomes are to be measured. And the standard that we have on involve your stakeholders principle number 1 is a piece of guidance and standards that sort of I'm very proud of and I think is a useful piece. But I don't know whether, you know, what the comparables are there in other methods, whether like in cost benefit analysis, you know, Daniel, do they have similar standards and guidance around deciding what to measure in CBA?
But yeah, I think you make a great point, Ben, and I would agree that that's where, when I currently look at the standards and guidance in SVI, I think that's where the strength is at the moment in those areas around the kind of the what to measure question. within areas like CBA, but CBA is quite broad, so it will have direct relationships to other methods like cross-utility analysis and quality-adjusted life years, which are used by the NHS at the moment. All of those things derive from a fundamental, I guess, principle within welfare economics. So they're very kind of born out of this theory within economics, and it is actually hard to try and determine what the materiality question is and how you determine those outcomes. And I've seen, you know, CBAs and other types of methods that have completely, you know, only focused on one or two outcomes, typically positive ones, and haven't considered the stakeholders that are going to disbenefit from something. So, you know, this materiality issue, I think, goes across the board. The complex thing within economics is there's quite a long history of research in it, and anyone coming to do something like a quality adjusted life year analysis or a CBA is kind of expected to know that, but it's not always fresh in their mind. So there's what we're saying within economics is that anything, you know, for something to be material, it effectively has to have an impact on something called utility, and that's just a very fancy term for people's well-being and welfare. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff around what utility actually is and how we define it. One of the ways that we could define it is by asking people how they feel. Another way could be by looking at what they choose, and the things that they choose are supposed to be, you know, better for their well-being. So there's lots of kind of stuff and research around that, and it's quite difficult to get involved in. And I think, you know, a lack within CBA is actually not having some hard and fast rules about materiality. The other one is we don't tend to do much with stakeholder groups at the start. So the stakeholder perspective comes in very heavily when we start measuring outcomes and values. So, you know, the stuff we've done recently for Stonehenge, that was a 5,000 person sample, for example, to get the values and the impacts. And in that process, we asked them a little bit about whether there are other types of outcomes. But I think, you know, adding more of the stakeholder perspective is another, I think, good angle, and something that could be shared out, you know, from SROI, as it were, into CBA. And I know that yourself or Jeremy Nichols have previously spoken to the Green Book team, you know, around the CBA guidelines, around potentially including that stakeholder perspective. The other thing I just want to note, and I've written about this quite a lot, but it's not really had the traction, I don't think, previously, but I think there's a massive opportunity for SRI or any other method out there that's not CBA to actually put a slightly different stamp on something. So one trajectory that I see is if we keep pushing methods like SRI to become more rigorous, what's eventually going to happen is it will just look like CBA, because the rigor that we know at the moment is all embodied within CBA, right? So you may have your stakeholder materiality kind of, you know, task at the start, but when we say, okay, you've got to measure outcomes this, you know, more rigorously and value this way more rigorously, there's not much differentiation to CBA at the moment. But there's a potential now, there's an opportunity for SRI to do something quite different, which is to start to pick up other types of aspects within social value. So one thing that CBA can't deal with, because it's not within its normative fabric, is things like human rights duty processes, right, which are becoming more and more big things. So, you know, people sometimes are willing to trade off human rights in terms of other types of positive outcomes just because we think there's a duty towards those rights. And there are methods within some of the philosophical disciplines that allow you to pick those types of things up in your evaluation. We can't do it in economics because it's a direct kind of, it's a very different approach to how we think about well-being. But that's a massive opportunity for SRI to take a stamp and to have a different type of evaluation there. So I think there's just as much opportunity in this conversation as there is in terms of, you know, looking through what you're currently doing.
That's really interesting, and particularly on the human rights angle, you know, that's been mentioned consistently throughout this week, actually, in many sessions, and perhaps, you know, it's the social value principles and that set an accountability framework that are there to protect human rights, and I think that's a nice seed of thought there for us to perhaps all think about and explore what that opportunity is. So yeah, we're kind of kicked around here. We've got SRI with some strengths, CBA with some strengths, and perhaps sort of gaps in both, in terms of where there could be stronger guidance and standards in applying each of them in a more holistic way. And one sort of interesting question we were exploring last week in our conversations was, can you say what's better? Is it better to have high rigor in deciding what outcomes to measure and low rigor in measuring the accuracy of those outcomes? Or would it be better to have low rigor in defining what the outcomes are and then high rigor in the accuracy of them? So it's kind of completeness versus accuracy. I don't know where you got to on your thinking with that one, Daniel. You're on mute. Sorry, Daniel.
Sorry. Yeah. That's a really interesting question. I think either of those trade-offs, we're not in an ideal place. We'd want to have completeness and rigor, right? I think we can probably all agree on that's where we'd want to get to. I think if you were to ask that question of a scientific community, they would probably err on the incompleteness, but with high rigor, just because at least some of the outcomes are being measured robustly, if that makes sense. My personal opinion is actually, I think they're probably equally bad or undesirable. And if we're in that situation, for me, it feels like it all depends on how we caveat that study. So if we've done a study which is incomplete in terms of the outcomes, i.e. we've measured 3 positive outcomes and we've only picked up 1 negative outcome, but we know there's 2 or 3 more other negative outcomes, but we've measured those very rigorously and valued them rigorously. If we are caveating the fact that this is going to be an overstatement of value, right, because we've missed out some of the negative outcomes, and maybe even giving the reader some magnitude of overestimate, is it going to likely to be 20% lower or something like that, I think we're in a better place. And then same again on the flip side, if we've got a very complete set of outcomes that we've picked up all of the positive and all of the negative, but our estimation process is not particularly rigorous, so very small sample sizes or incomplete data, that type of thing, but we might be able to make a judgment on, okay, the method that we use is likely to overstate the impact, and try and give the reader then a sense of which direction the magnitude of the bias or the inaccuracies are going to be. So I think you can kind of still get away with either type of study as long as they're caveated correctly. But I'd want to hopefully move the conversation towards one where we're maximizing both elements, both the completeness and the rigor at the same time.
Yeah, I think, I'm probably in agreement with you there, and that there's no right answer to that question, but the transparency is key, and recognizing what sort of decisions are being made will largely determine, whether you want high rigor in the completeness versus the accuracy. And I think, we're sort of, transparency is obviously critical in that, in before helping decision makers know where the strengths and weaknesses lie in the analysis, and perhaps assurance as well. And that's an important piece in this puzzle. Do you have any thoughts on assurance, both in terms of SRI and CBA?
So assurance in CBA is it's a bit of a mixed bag, I would say. So in our there's no assuring body, global body or anything like that. And what we typically tend to find is if it's a very high profile project, our study will be reviewed anonymously by maybe 2 or 3 academics or something like that. But it's completely up to the government or the client as to whether they actually have that peer review done or not. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, and I think that's another area where SVI or SROI, has an advantage in that assurance area. I think my slight qualm with the insurance process at the moment is about the fact that it's assuring the principles rather than the rigor. And I think, could we get to a place where we have some benchmarks or a checklist, even at the kind of very simple stage, like is the sample representative? Is it at least 50 people or something like that? These types of fairly simple questions that we could answer. They could become more rigorous and detailed later on, but I think that might be the next process. So completely agree with the assurance. Agree that you need to assure against the 7 principles. I would say, could we get then to stage 2, which is then assuring on rigor in some areas, and that could be baby steps, but there's a lot more that we could do.
Yeah, that's right. And the assurance, as you said, has always been about testing whether principles have been understood and applied. but it has stopped short of testing whether the appropriate level of rigor is fully there, or certainly reference to other standards. So yeah, really interesting. I suppose just before we open it up to questions then, let's just unpick the idea that you briefly mentioned about a potential way forward then would be around having some form of rating system, or some sort of, maybe even a decision tree of, like, you know, if this is the type of decision you're trying to make sure that you've got this level of rigor here and it's okay to compromise here. Is that what, you know, you were alluding to?
Yeah, I think so. So for me, there are two clear areas that could be rated, as it were. One is the decision itself. So how serious or how irreversible is the decision, right? And that could be on a scale of 1 to 5, where multi-billion-pound projects around climate change, for example, are at level 5. So we've got to have the highest levels of rigor for that. Whereas at level 1, they might be quick, things that need a quick turnaround time. The decision can be reversible. The level of investment is not huge. And we have very little evidence about what works previously. So it's almost getting into kind of a piloting and experimenting. Then lower levels of rigor might be acceptable there. So it feels like there's a rating around the decision, and there's a rating around the methodology that aligns to it. So one clean way would be, if it's a 4-star rating in terms of the decision, so it's fairly serious, you need at least a 4-star rating on the methodology. And that, what I'm talking about here is not different shades of CBA or something like that. This is across different types of methods. And you may not even always need a valuation element, right? So you can kind of do a social impact analysis where it's just, have you created more jobs, or are people healthier, or are people getting more qualifications because of it? That's all you might need without the valuation. And that might be more at the lower star level, because you're not talking about value. But that would feel like quite a nice bit of progress for me, where it's almost this kind of jigsawing. You can look at the decision level of the rigor required, and then you can apply the correct methodology to it. And just on the latter, in terms of the methodology, there are a bunch of what are called evidence scales now that have emerged. They started within health science and health economics, and they're now across the board. So you've got them in kind of social justice, education, environment, and they're really about how different statistical methods should be applied to understand cause and effect relationships. And they do differ a lot. So in health, it's very hard on the RCTs, for example, that it needs to be randomly assigned, double-blind controlled trials, that type of thing, and everything else is pretty dodgy below that. Whereas in social science, they would acknowledge things like those types of experiments, but they open it up much more, and you'd have other levels as well that are acceptable. So there is precedent around this, to be able to do that. That would be the star rating on the method side. There's a bigger question about the star rating or the ranking in terms of the decision, I think.
And I think, so we need to look at what precedents there are out there in terms of scales to articulate levels of rigor, and because there must exist in some other forms of academia. I suppose the other thing just to add to that then is to bear in mind people will have different risk appetites. So it's not to say that people won't use that information, but at least if they can see using that sort of rating system, even if it's low, they still might have an appetite for risk that says, we're going to make this decision anyway. So okay, so we've covered a lot there, and I can see the chat's been very busy, which is great. So we've got a highly engaged audience. So I suppose rather than read through them, if it's okay, maybe we'll ask you just to chip in, as some of the questions were asked a while ago. Maybe they've been answered. Sarah, you were first up there. Have you got any questions or reflections on this conversation so far?
Well, hi there. I was not necessarily hoping to speak because I've written my questions into the chat, but I think it might be interesting to hear Daniel's thoughts on what the sort of range of acceptable error rates would be using the benchmark of CBAs as he has seen them, ranging from CBAs used for huge resource allocation decisions and then CBAs that may have been used for much smaller resource allocation decisions. Is there a standard error rate that you've seen in very tiny resource allocation decisions, for example, that we might view as a sort of benchmark against which to compare the 300 to 1,000% error rate that you mentioned in SROI?
Thanks, Sarah. Sorry to call on you.
So those error rates are across a bunch of methods. Just to make that clear, we in government reviewed SROIs, we reviewed impact assessments, we reviewed health impact assessments, and just generic statistical studies as well. So those are errors across lots of different dimensions. This, I think, debate also has two dimensions: the level that we are kind of comfortable with in terms of any form of error. So the statistical, technical, I guess, way about thinking about this is what are the levels of acceptance within statistics. So when we say in statistics that there is no impact, or these two different population groups are actually similar in terms of particular characteristics, or they divergent, and that type of statistical question, or are people taller in the 20th century than they were in the 19th century, for example, all of those types of questions, we tend to usually deal with around 10% error margin in making those statements. That's within economics. When you get into statistics and econometrics, they are a bit tighter. They typically ask for about 5%. That's the same in health evaluation as well. So those are quite low margins of error. But I think we can't just rely on that kind of statistical error to inform it, because that's more around kind of academic publications and potentially some of the the very large investments. When we're talking about smaller investments, we probably have to overlay on that a level of risk and appetite around it. So by the organizations that are going to use that. So if one study has used a particular method that we know on average is generating about 50% errors, which is above the 10% threshold that I just mentioned, I think it's a case of whether that that company or that organization is willing to take that risk of that additional 40%. So I'm not sure if we can get to a series of error margins that we're comfortable with unless we take these ones from kind of science more broadly, which are around that 10% mark, which doesn't give you a huge amount to play with, if that makes sense.
So I guess the answer is that we don't necessarily have such a benchmark already established. Is that fair to say? Because yeah. CBA in small settings where perhaps a $50,000 effort has been made to do the CBA to inform a couple $100,000 resource allocation decision, let's say, just hasn't been done. Is that fair?
So within CBA, the results that we present are always statistically tested. Whatever the whether it's the outcomes that are being measured or whether it's at the stage of the valuation, the values are always statistically tested to see if they're significantly different from zero or whatever the null or the hypothesis is. So broadly speaking, if a CBA is done correctly, we're pretty confident at about the 90% level, so the inverse of that the value that we are estimating is about right. So within CBA we have that parameter. It's just whether we would want to apply that at the outset across all types of social value study, and in particular those types of ones that you've just mentioned now, small in the hundreds of thousands, $100,000 or $200,000 worth of investment. Mm-hmm. Do we still want to apply that 10% rule there? I'm not sure. I don't have the answer on that one, I'm afraid. We'd have to, I think about the risk appetite. But when we're getting into, in the billions and stuff like that, and when you're having that work reviewed by academics and stuff, you need to be tight, and you need to be at that kind of 5 to 10% level of error to do that type of stuff. So it's going to depend a little bit. I've seen Jenny raise a few issues about proportionality in her comments. It is a proportional question. And that would be an interesting debate to have, I think, with SVI. What are the margins of error? If we say it's 10% at the top level, what are we comfortable with down at the smaller investment level? Mm-hmm.
And just a last point on that, I think, and then I'll cede the conversation to others, is what is the error rate one sees in, for example, venture investing at the angel stage of investment, just in terms of what kind of financial return is expected and what is actually generated, as another way of setting a benchmark. I would think error rates of between 300 and 1,000% in those cases would be quite common.
Yeah, I would agree. So I think all of that stuff's good to bring on. It probably just needs a concerted debate and effort around addressing those questions together.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Really great points and interesting discussion on error rates. Got a few more people with comments and questions. Tim, I'm going to turn to you next. Have we answered the questions that you were posting, or have you still got more? Tim Goodspeed. You're on mute. You're on mute, Tim.
Not anymore, hopefully.
Yep.
No, I mean, if you've got Daniel in a room, I've always got questions. Hi, Daniel.
Hiya.
Firstly, good to see you. I think it would be great if we could document so many of the areas where we agree here. I think that discernment between the normative starting point of why do a cost-benefit analysis and why do an SROI, we agree on, and that would be great. I think there are some areas within that where we should be taking the same approach in terms of, is data good enough for valuation as an element of that, but that is by far not the be all and end all of an SROI. So I think there's a nuance in there between finding the bits that should be comparable and understanding those on a range of proportionality and rigor, and some things which are completely different and understanding why they're different. I love the idea of proportionality and ranges of understanding the question first, and therefore how good should your answer be in assurance, and I've always argued for that. So having said kind of 95% of stuff that we agree, I'm interested in that. I think some of the hypothesis behind this question is SROIs have too big an error rate. And if you take, I think, p-value as an example of that, that masks some of these normative things about whether the question was right to ask in the first place, and that's where I think the challenge lies. I did, for example, a few SROIs on UK drug and alcohol statutory provision that aimed to challenge whether we were asking the right question or not, whether we were including families, whether we were treating the user in both senses of the word as an individual, rather than what the cost benefit analysis, which was rigorous, statistically significant, and way more data and expertise than I could ever get near, but that basically concluded that most of the value was in reduced demand on the criminal justice service. Therefore, a user was a risk of being a criminal, and you're talking about the risk of the decision. The decision is about, in that this was before the ring fencing was removed, but the decision was about billions of public health money on drug and alcohol treatment that distorted those services to stopping those people becoming criminals, not treating them as individuals and bringing any of these other things in. So I understand where you're coming from with the error rate, but I mean, if you looked at those in your mix, and they're old now, so they may well have been in your mix, a group of assured SROI reports that I did there, you will find massive error rates. But when I go and look at the cost benefit analysis with p-values of under 5%, it was asking fundamentally the wrong question and distorting, in my view, significant amounts of public spend to treat individuals as potential criminals. And that the judgment on what the data told us about value there, which compared, for example, the value to the individual, which came out as 70 quid based on the willingness to pay for a quali, compared with £30,000 worth of the potential demands if they carry on their behaviours in terms of costs to the criminal justice system. The influence on the decision about how to deliver that service was based on, I think, completely the wrong question and the wrong method. Having got there, they then had a statistically significant answer in what I think was the wrong method.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to push back a bit on taking error rates, quality of data as a kind of proxy for how well we've answered a question and dealt with an issue, and how we improve. Accountability to society and delivery of public spend.
I think it's a good point. And if I may go first, Daniel, just all we're trying to do is bring transparency to this discussion more than anything. You know, if that, it's not, I don't think we should make this conversation all about error rates. I think it should be about understanding that there are two areas to look at rigor, and the area in deciding what should be included is important. And if there hasn't been high rigor in determining what all the outcomes are, then at least we need to be clear on that. And then the accuracy one is the second one. So I feel like, you know, we're in agreement here, Tim. I don't think there's a disagreement, but Daniel, maybe you've got other views.
I think it's a good point, Tim, and it's really in line with that question that Ben posed earlier on, which is the completeness versus rigor question, where I think we're indeterminate between the two, to be honest. It sounded like that's very much a live example of that. So a more complete set of outcomes in SROI, but maybe not measured to the same level of rigor as the simultaneous CBA, which then had much, you know, less completeness, as it were. So I absolutely agree that there's difficulties in making a judgment, and there's obviously going to be issues with every single method in terms of how they're applied. Just to go back to the stuff that I was originally doing in government in kind of comparing methods, we were doing that on a level playing field, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is where it could have been an SRI, it could have been a quality adjusted life year analysis, whatever the evaluation method was. We looked at it and we said, okay, let's hold constant the outcomes. So we're going to use the same outcomes, but we're just going to measure it at a higher level of rigor, right? Or value it at a higher level of rigor. So we're not judging the completeness question, we're just judging the rigor question. We would find these errors of margins of error, if that makes sense. So everything else held constant. Okay, you've gone through your stakeholder process, or you've determined what the outcomes are, and then you've measured them. Let's see if there's a difference between what's been done and those other types of studies that are higher level of rigor, and that's where we get the margin. We don't have any, those studies didn't have anything to say about the completeness error, so we weren't looking at how complete the study was. So I think that's another thing that needs to be chucked in, and it is, you know, in terms of this debate, and it's something that, you know, Ben and I think, you know, are really aware of. But thank you for your comment, and I think, yeah, it would be great to have you involved in that kind of, you know, completeness issue. I think really any method, you know, even if things like the environmental impact assessments, if we broaden it out a little bit, you know, they can be prone to not including all forms of wildlife or biodiversity and things like that. So it's a massive issue, and if we could do something in terms of guidance or standards around that, I think that's where we start to have a positive impact.
Okay.
And maybe,
Can I come back, Ben?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Thanks, Daniel. I agree. So I think the key to a lot of this is transparency. You know, transparency as to what an SROI assurance means, and maybe, you know, it's assurance of the principles. Therefore, it's confirming that this is an SROI. It is not saying, therefore, just because it is an SROI and has evidence of 7 principles, it's comparable with a 5-star cost-benefit analysis. The level playing field then is transparency and setting out more of that normative starting point for what question a cost benefit analysis is aiming to answer, and it has answered that question well. So which leads me to the question of then, well, how do we get those combinations of completeness and rigor, where we would argue more about completeness, but we don't have the expertise or the resource in many of areas where SROI is practiced to get the rigor. So how do we get completeness and rigor and the appropriate level of completeness and rigor for all of these?
Yeah, I don't know. I think one thing I've thought about for a while is the issue on training. So are there some practitioners that would want to have higher levels of training? That's going to incur, it'll be a lot of time, but and a lot of reading, but that might open up certain avenues and areas of knowledge that they could start to take away and think about, okay, do we apply this in SROI? What level of rigors do we need? It's probably a bit of a knowledge share exercise at the start, in terms of a two-way street, I guess, on that one would be for me.
Yeah.
Mm. All good signs that the market's maturing in my eyes. Great, thanks, Tim. Just keen to give other people opportunity. There's been a lot of chat. So Jenny, thanks for all your comments and things on the chat. Would you like to ask a question or share any reflections?
Yeah, hang on. Just get my video started.
Hello.
Hi, so I suppose the last thing I said was maybe the most useful. I'm just trying to find it. So I think we could just see that actually we're kind of, I've said violently agreeing, but let's try and make it not violent. I think we're generally in agreement. There's some bits here where we could argue about the use of language and fine, whatever, but actually there's lots of really terrible practice out there, and maybe we should be thinking how we can unite to drive out that terrible practice. And I would say a lot of the areas of terrible practice I see are just in terms of people not really applying any kind of thought to the decision that they're making, picking indicators off a shelf that aren't even indicators of an outcome, that kind of stuff. And actually a lot of decisions that get made, important decisions that get made, for example, the example I've brought in is the way that in the UK, this idea of social value in procurement has been developed is terrible. There's really bad practice there. And actually we should be addressing that, not sort of, I think, yeah, as well as having this discussion. I think it's a really helpful discussion, but I think, let's think about what people practically do, because actually the number of people that people that commission a CBA to the sort of standard that Daniel's talking about, they're going to go to Daniel. They're not going to come to me. I wouldn't want them to come to me, but it's like, have I made the point clearly? I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I'm maybe slightly rambling here.
I think so. There's a lot of bad out there, which perhaps, on this rating or scale system would be low rigor in terms of deciding what to measure, and low rigor in actually measuring the accuracy of that. I think that,
low completeness and that seems to, the emerging language seems to be low completeness and low rigor. Yeah, exactly. And maybe we should be thinking, well, where are the areas that we need to improve the practice on that, because it's pretty shocking, and I know it's leading to a lot of really bad decisions. For example, people counting number of women employed in areas where they traditionally maybe haven't had been employed, but actually they're being employed into roles where they feel where they're discriminated against. And it's really uncomfortable, and they end up leaving, and maybe they even end up leaving their chosen profession. Maybe they're an engineer and they can't cope with the workplace environment, and we're effectively supporting that to happen. I think those are the sorts of things that we should be addressing, and it's an issue of both completeness and appropriate rigor to that decision. I would say probably the level of rigor you need in that decision is maybe not that high, because it exists. So you should therefore say, well, maybe we should try and figure out how to stop it existing.
yeah,
I think that is a good point, but I also think that as the standard bearer for SROI, SVI will get sort of tarred with anything that goes around calling itself an SROI, whether it associates itself with SVI's methodology or not. So there is essentially a PR issue here, separate from the methodological issue, and that's not the scope of this conversation per se, but I do think it's an issue that the organization ought to have a plan around and ought to be doing something with, which relates to your point, Jenny, a little bit.
I think that's right. I think, you know, SRI has always been something that's been out there, open source, people can have a go at doing it, and that's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because it means people can get involved, but that means there's also a lot of things out there that we wouldn't look at and say, that's not SRI, that isn't SRI at all. So assurance has always been our way of kind of trying to protect that. But I think now, more than ever, to Jenny's point, there is so much stuff out there that is perhaps not very good, and to your point, Sarah, bringing down the reputation of SRI, that we need to either be stronger on the assurance or adapt the assurance, perhaps to be more accommodating to these different nuances in what is good and what is good enough data.
Yeah, and I think that there needs to be both, and there needs to be first, hey guys, assurance is a thing that you can do. When something is assured, you can expect it to be at least to a certain quality in the following ways. And then to Daniel's point, there has not been assurance of whether, for example, the financial proxies that are being applied, let alone the measurement techniques that are being used, are appropriate given the case at hand. That isn't part of assurance right now. And until that's part of assurance, which is it's a much higher bar and it costs a lot more to do well, there's going to be problems. So I think maybe there needs to be some differentiation of like a threshold in terms of the importance of the impacts and or the scale of the decision that would kick in a need for the assurance to include assurance of those kinds of issues. And that needs to be super obviously color coded or something in the assurance scheme that gets publicized.
That sounds like you're volunteering to get involved, Sarah. But no, absolutely. That's kind of the direction of travel in our thinking. So it's good to test these ideas and let's, as I said at the beginning, set up a working group and really unpick it in more detail, which we won't resolve in this hour. But there's a few other people that have been active. So I just want to give Paul the opportunity next to perhaps chip in. Paul, are you there still?
Yeah, so I'm still here. I'm not sure where the full conversation has gone. I think largely in agreement. The peer review is definitely something that's needed. I've gone in and looked at, and these are very credible people that I've looked at that have published these things. This isn't like, I don't know, a newbie, a junior. These are people that are well respected. I've gone in, I'm like, you've completely done your statistics wrong, or you're making conclusions that vulnerable populations strongly disagree with and find oppressive. So, you know, but they're seen from a lot of other people as being very rigorous study design. So these are very important issues that need addressing, and I think, you know, generally, I think the lessons is tailoring rigor and expanding the concepts of rigor beyond when we think of it. It's usually around in terms of those positivistic scientific design, but rigor really needs to include those things around ethics, around you know, there's another like practicality, like not just, you know, could it do harm if the conclusions are wrong, and all those other things. We need to expand what rigor actually means. So that's what I'm taking from this conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. And keeps bringing me back to the idea that you had, Daniel, around human rights as well, and ethics, and an opportunity perhaps for SRI to kind of position itself in something that protects human rights and the sorts of things you were talking about. Daniel, did you have any comments, reflections on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the last 3 or 4 comments have just been around this need for different types of rigor and guidance or assurance, and I think that's right. And you know, it looks like we're talking about two broad principles: the completeness, I would call that kind of the normative or the moral principle, and then the more positive or scientific principle around the measurement itself. You know, if you take something like the quality adjusted life year, which is 20, 30 years old now, more than that actually, you know, a really big area in health that all health organizations are using in terms of measuring their impact. They're amazing on the measurement side. The completeness side is not great because it doesn't really, we know now that it doesn't really capture mental health. So we've done a lot of work around how the quality doesn't really include mental health, and is not sensitive to changes in mental health. It's much more around physical health. So I think we want to avoid that situation where it's all piled into one area, whether it's completeness or rigor, and to kind of, you know, work on all fronts. But for me, I think it's about how SRI is situated on the long spectrum of different impact evaluation methods, and how you make it, you know, really distinct, and how it adds value to other things out there at the moment. Because at the moment it's kind of seen as a smaller brother to CBA, but, you know, can it be its own brother in its own right, you know, and do something else, I think is the question for me.
Interesting. I'm really conscious of time, and there's two more good questions in the chat. So I'm going to call out Clive and then Anjani in our remaining 3 minutes. Clive, are you there?
Yep. I'm here.
Hold yours.
I think one thing that's been really, really valuable here is actually looking at how we can practically apply this within our work. And it's really, I'm working particularly now on next week, I have a meeting with the European Union strategy for the Alpine region on the issue of what they call smart villages, but it's more villages of the future. And there's a real opportunity now to start introducing, so not just social, but it's really looking at sort of global impact analysis in the design of the future strategies. But I'm at the moment extremely reluctant to put forward beyond a more simplistic approach because of this sort of lack of rigor and the questioning. And it's really about how to improve the general skill levels and the tools that are available and the guidance to ensure that if we do manage to make what it would be a breakthrough, that actually this is, the results are rigorous, and also the people who are delivering it is rigorous. And I count myself among them. So it's really an advice about this guidance and the other rigor tools you're talking about. How can we work together to ensure those are both available and then put into practice?
Good question, and I'll be working hard to make sure that we can provide more of this guidance and make sense of all these tools that exist. So, thanks.
Okay.
Do stay involved, and we welcome all thoughtful contributions to this as we leave today and put this into practice. Last question then. Got 1 minute, but Anjani, are you there?
Hi.
Hi.
What I'm hearing is there are a lot of good ideas that can be cross-pollinated between SROI and CBA, so that's a good thing. I was curious about two questions. So one is for any intervention, the utility, there is a concept of marginal utility in economics. So the utility value for the same stakeholder reduces over time. So I'm curious to know how that is factored in. And second, particularly in the long-term infrastructure projects, how do you consider the positive or the negative impact on the next generation? You know, can you throw some light on it, Daniel and Ben, anybody else? Thank you.
Thanks, Anjani. That's some really good questions. In the limited time, Daniel, do you want to attempt that, or should we?
I'll say something just really quickly about future generations, because it's something we've done a lot on in heritage. So heritage is one of our main sectors, and the value embodied in something like Stonehenge or a museum is very often, you know, for future generations. But in a similar way, you know, you would have the same types of arguments for things like the environmental protection now benefits people in the future. So it's a very tricky issue. So one way that you could look at it is something called non-use value. So non-use value is the value that people place on it, even if they're not directly consumers of a particular thing. And within non-use value, one element of that is an idea called bequest value. So I would be willing to pay to preserve something, or I place a value on something like Stonehenge now, just because the fact that I value people in 300 years time being able to see the stones and learn about the stones, and that should show up in what we call my utility function, or my well-being function, as it were. And it should be a part of my quality of life. So I would in principle be willing to pay for it, or I could in principle, you could estimate a value for that. So you could get a value in as far as current generations internalize the preferences and well-being of future generations. You can get a snapshot of the value by asking current generations. The other way that we've looked at it is values that are derived right now for current users, to look at how that value is driven by their underlying characteristics like gender, income, ethnicity, region, and then try and estimate over time how a particular area that's going to impact or benefit from something, how that might change. So are we going to see more immigration, for example, from ethnic minority groups into that area? And if so, we might be able to estimate a slightly modified value based on that. So there are kind of predictive, more data science related ways that we've looked at trying to predict the value as well going into the future. So I'll leave it at that because we're over time.
Right.
But hopefully that responds a little bit.
It's a great question. Thank you, Daniel. And I'm sure we can have another hour just on that one. So maybe we'll book that in. But it's the end. It's Friday. It's coming to the end of the conference. And I'm going to have to draw this fascinating discussion to a close as well, as we're over time. So first of all, thank you to Daniel for your time today, and also bringing these issues to us, and in the spirit of collaboration, hopefully we can work together in carving out pathways to progress the movement and the agenda. So my final thanks is to you all, because it was a really, really good discussion today. Thank you for all your questions and reflections. I feel like there's as Jenny said, an overwhelming agreement here, actually, which makes it easy to see a path forward. But the devil is always in the detail, in the solutions. So I do invite you all to be part of a working group that I'll be setting up in the next week or two to kind of really delve into how we can provide better guidance and standards on these issues. Okay, thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Fridays, weekends, stay safe, speak soon.
Thank you, bye.